Battlefield 6 open beta is here, so obviously that means we're gonna start seeing whether or not you need to upgrade your systems to take advantage of Battlefield 6. Now I'll say this, little spoiler alert, I spent a lot of time over the last day and a half just trying out different hardware when it comes to Battlefield, and I will say that the Frostbite engine holds up and that you don't need a lot of high-end hardware to be able to run this title. Now I'm excited about Battlefield. 2042 launched as a hot pile of steamy shit, and it got better over time. Battlefield 4 was okay. It had some of the buggiest launches we'd ever seen, and then don't forget the atrocity they gave us after that called Hardline. Battlefield 3 is still kind of the GOAT for most recent stuff if we're not taking into account Bad Company 2, which was probably one of the pinnacles of Battlefield. But I will tell you right now, with nearly 300,000 people joining the open beta in just the last 24 hours, it is one of the most anticipated titles. So of course we had to run a bunch of GPUs through the open beta to see how they perform, so you guys can determine whether or not in October you need to get some new hardware. The Be Quiet light-based PC case features a flippable design for either an upright or lay-flat orientation, cable trays and covers, and supports newer backside connector motherboards for a super clean build. Sleek and minimalistic design with integrated RGB lighting offers tasteful design cues, and radiators up to 420 millimeters are supported in the light-based 900 model. To see the full list of specs of the Be Quiet light-based 600 and 900, follow the link in the description below. Now here's the thing when it comes to benchmarking EA titles. They don't let you change hardware more than 5 times in a 24-hour period. I think they do that because of account sharing and a bunch of other reasons. So it means we're kind of limited into how much hardware we could get tested in the short amount of time that we have availability with the open beta, which is, we had early access starting the 4th, and it's gonna go through just this weekend and then next weekend, obviously. So we tried to figure out what hardware would be the most relevant when it comes to GPUs to test out Battlefield 6 to see whether or not it's gonna be relevant to you. So we of course started with one of the original GOATs. The 3060 Ti is one of the most highly represented graphics cards when it comes to the Steam survey. Now, of course, the Steam survey only represents those that opt into the Steam survey, but it's about the only survey we really have to go off of. We obviously went with the 3070, which was arguably one of the most popular and affordable gaming GPUs. Well, I say affordable lightly. Anyway, when it comes to gaming GPUs, we've seen since the 40 series and 50 series increase of 70 series GPUs. From there, we also tested the 4060. Just because I had to throw a 60 series in there for the newer gen stuff, I guess, which kind of covers the 5060 as well. As we know, 40 series, 50 series cards are the same architecture. There's some CUDA changes, some here, some there, and mostly clock changes. But anyway, we do have a 4060, and I believe it is an 8 gigabyte model. We do not have a 4060 16 gigs, so that gives us an idea of VRAM. And then we also tested it with a 4080, because 80 tier GPUs still seem to be about where things should cap out when it comes to being, you know, the most power that you need. We threw a 6800 XT Red Devil and a 7800 XT Red Devil covering 2 generations of AMD. Didn't bother to test the 9070 XT. You know it's gonna run fine on a 9070 XT. In fact, it'll probably run fantastic on a 9070 XT. So no reason to even bother with that. But I wanted to see where it caps out. Like, what is the most performance that you could get? So of course, threw a Founders Edition 5090 on there, kind of for lulz, just to top out the chart. So with that said, we tested average frames per second. Weren't able to do our 5% and 1% lows in the manner that we normally would, mostly because of time, and 2, because of the fact that PresentMon cannot hook the game with our PresentMon GUI that we use for our normal GPU testing. Also too, you have to keep in mind these numbers are kind of all over the place when it comes to the FPS charts because this is multiplayer only. And because this multiplayer only means we are not getting a consistent run-to-run comparison. But we do still have usable data here to tell you what the average FPS looks like across the board. And because we charted out the FPS, we'll be able to see what the average looks like and how much fluctuation there was depending on what part of the map that we were in. Now I tried to run a really consistent track through these maps. I had to requeue multiples of dozens of times to make sure I get the same map every time we do those runs between graphics cards. So it's not like I just went into Conquest and was like, whatever map I get is what I get. No, we ran 2 maps on this, Siege of Cairo, you know, Exit Strategy, and then Liberation Peak, Ridge 13 were the 2 maps that I chose. So looking at FPS first, just average FPS, you can see here the 5090 gets us a 257.2 in Ridge 13 and a 231.4 in Siege of Cairo. One of the main reasons I chose the 5090 as well is we want to look for any sort of CPU bottlenecking or how much CPU util we're going to be utilizing, because CPU is the other half of the equation. We'll talk about that in a moment here. In terms of our settings though, it's important to note that we are running these settings at 1440p. We have the high preset set for quality, performance preset was set to balanced, and then we have DLSS also on set to balance for NVIDIA graphics cards. And the AMD cards are using FSR balance. So basically the same settings across the board, just FSR versus DLSS. We did not turn frame gen on. We did not turn on feature frame rendering. We just left it as standard settings across the board and no sort of frame gen or AI involvement other than the upscaler. Moving on, the 4080, as you can see right here, caps us out at 176.6 and 174.8 respectively, pretty close together on the FPS versus the 5090. Now, if we take a look as we move down the chart, you can see that we were running 144 hertz panel, so obviously we want to get as close to that number as possible. Anything beyond that would be kind of overkill for our panel. Anything below that means that we have capability of our panel that we're not able to leverage. So for us, the sweet spot on this test was going to be about 144 hertz, or as close to that as we could get with these settings. And that was the 7800 XT Red Devil. That basically exceeded 144 a little bit in Liberation Peak at 152.7, and then we hit that magic number 144.3 on Siege of Cairo. Now you can see here by looking at this chart, Siege of Cairo is a little bit harder to run than Ridge, which is kind of funny because Ridge is a more open, long view. Like you have a very long range that you can see in Ridge, but Cairo has a lot more buildings and a lot more destruction and a lot more explosives and things happening, which could be obviously affecting the FPS a little more than something like Ridge. But the 6800 XT is like right on its heels. It's a 140.2 and a 131. Now the 6800 XT is actually proving to be a really strong performer in this game right now. But the crazy part is on Amazon right now this second, it'll probably be gone by the time this video is live, there is a sale, a 20% off sale going with Gigabyte on their 7800 XT for $399 with 50 sold in the past and 9 left. That's a crazy, insane deal because most of them are going for over $600 right now. So if you can jump on that, that is gonna be a hell of an upgrade for someone. Anyway, moving on now into the 3070, which is still, in my opinion, one of the GOATs when it comes to GPUs. It's getting 108.9 and a 98.3 between Ridge and Exit Strategy, and that's pretty strong. If we look at the fact that that is a 5-year going on 6-year-old GPU, it'll be 5 years in September, next month. It'll be a 5-year-old GPU. And that just goes to show actually how well optimized the Frostbite engine is, that it can still use older hardware like that. That's only on 2nd gen Tensor cores, right? So DLSS, it's on an older gen Tensor core. There's no ray tracing in this title as far as I can tell. Like there's no settings to be able to change any of that. But it's a 5-year-old GPU on a modern AAA title at 1440p that is getting over 100 FPS on Ridge and 98.3 FPS on Cairo, with these settings the way they are. Now you could obviously dial it in to get more FPS, but the crazy part is like, it is performing very well, which means if you're fine with 100 FPS and you don't have a monitor that's like, you're not running like a 360 hertz or some crazy high refresh rate monitor, it doesn't feel like there's any real need to upgrade if you have a 3070. Now this could change. I say that because we've seen the open betas be smaller maps than you tend to find when the game fully launches, and there might be other game modes and stuff that might make it harder on the graphics card. So once the full launch of the title comes out, we'll have to kind of retest some of this to see if it got harder over time. We have seen the beta be pretty well optimized, and then the full title comes out, and then suddenly there's an anchor dragging your GPU down into the depths of FPS hell. So we want to make sure that's not going to happen. 3060 Ti, as you can see, still a very strong performer. We now know why the recommendation is a 3060 Ti, because you're still exceeding 60 FPS by a lot. 91.1 in 1440p and 88.6, once again, 1440p. Remember, this 1440p and 3060 Ti in a modern AAA title is no small task, and it's doing a very good job at it. And then the 4060 Dual even coming in at an 85.7 and a 79.1. So it doesn't feel like, if you're running a GPU of the last 5 or 6 years, I would have loved to test some 20 series on here too, but having to mix in some NVIDIA and some AMD, I could probably this weekend maybe get some 20 series on there as well. But we ran out of, we burned like on my account, plus my work PC and my home PC, and use Nick's account to be able to get some of these GPUs on there, because every time you switch the GPU, it burns hardware use, and you only get 5 per 24-hour period. Yeah, and I didn't want to lock Nick out of being able to play at home, so we had to stop where we did on the amount of GPUs that we have here. But I think 20 series would probably still perform pretty well, mostly because as far as we can tell right now, there's no ray tracing in the title. Now, of course, if you just turn ray tracing off, then that's a moot point. Now let's talk about frame rate over time. Now this is different than frame time, which we've normally charted. This is average FPS, or the actual FPS counter over time. So you can see the fluctuations. Now frame time also equates to FPS. It's just the inverse. Like frames per second means how many frames were drawn in a second. And then each one of those frames divided, how many frames that is divided by the second is frame time, but you get some frame times that are paced closer together than others. I just want to see what the FPS charted over time looks like. So if we take a look at our FPS line graph for Ridge, you can see right here the 5090 obviously is bouncing all over the place. There's many reasons for that, probably some engine limitations. I mean, we are exceeding 270 and hitting 280 FPS. If you guys remember, the older Frostbite engine on like Battlefield 3 capped out at 200. So obviously they've been able to lift that engine over time, but we're still probably hitting some pretty hard caps on the engine, which is why it's bouncing around like it is, because the frequency was fluctuating with that as well. And the util was obviously not maxed out. It was staying in like the 70s and 80s. So I do think when you look at the CPU chart, you'll see it wasn't a CPU bottleneck. I do think that's an engine thing. Now, what I would have obviously done with the 5090 is I wouldn't be running 24 or 1440p at balance and performance settings. I'd be running that at 4K, maxed out everything, ultra everything, and I would probably be running at closer to native res, if any DLSS at all, just because it'd be able to. So we wouldn't take any of the fidelity hit of running DLSS even in quality mode. We could just run it native resolution and it would have plenty of power to do it. But it's funny because if you take a look now at the 4080, there's a significant drop in performance between the 5090 and the 4080. It drops all the way down to under 200 FPS, starts around the 190s and drops down into the 160s, depending on what's happening in the game. Now, some of these low spikes that you see, I've noticed correlate with big explosions happening near me. And that makes sense because that's a lot of processing that has to happen for the GPU when it comes to volumetric lighting and other things that are happening. So that's the downside of this not being able to be a solid track, is I can't control when those explosions happen, but this is a more real world example of what happens with the FPS when different things in the title are happening. But as you move down below these top tier products, you can see the FPS really smooths out. There's a lot less of those peaks and valleys or those crazy dips and crazy spikes. It's a much smoother experience. In fact, if you take a look on here at the 3070, which is the bright yellow line, I might change these colors. Orange and yellow look very close. Like I might change that. So you can see the 3070 just kind of really tightrope walking on that 110 FPS mark right there in Ridge. So it's very, very smooth. But what's really surprising here too is how well the AMD cards are performing. The 7800 XT and the 6800 XT are just absolutely dancing around that 140 to 150 FPS mark. That is some solid performance, especially if you're running a 6800 XT. 7800 XT, if this is the title you're most interested in, definitely do not need to run out and feel the need to spend money on a newer graphics card. There's just no need for it. 9070 XT probably would perform very, very well in this title, but it would just be money wasted because you really wouldn't notice the FPS difference. Because here's the crazy part. Although my 4080 on here is hitting near 200 FPS, it was almost indistinguishable playing on the 4080 versus playing on the 3070. And the reason for that is the smoothness of the frame rate on the 3070. So smoothness on frame rate is much more important than higher average frame rate, because if that frame rate's bouncing all over the place, it's spiking 200 and then going down to 110 and then 150 and then 200 and 120, that fluctuation up and down is going to perceive choppiness or stuttering. And so having a smoother frame rate is going to be better. So it was pretty impressive, even what the 3060 Ti was capable of doing at that purple line. Like I said, it's just tightrope around 90 FPS. Very smooth, and it was actually a pretty enjoyable gaming experience. There was plenty of times when the benchmark was done, I just continued playing out some of the round before I would stop and move on to the next test. It was just that much, I was that less aware of the hardware that I was using and was much more aware of the game, which is exactly what you want with your hardware. Now the story is pretty much the same with Siege of Cairo exit strategy. You can see the 5090s just kind of all over the place, up and down. Again, I think we've just absolutely saturated the engine's capabilities with that. I won't go through each one of these lines for the graphics cards. You can see in Siege of Cairo, they're a little more separated than they were on Ridge, and that's because Cairo is harder to run. So there's more of a separation between the FPS. But you can see the clear hierarchy here. The two AMD cards landing right between the overpriced 40 and 50 series cards, and obviously performing way better than the older generation 60 and 70 tier cards. Again, right around that 140, 150 FPS mark. It was a very smooth gaming experience. I will say this though, I did try testing the Power Color 7900 GRE or the Global Release Edition card, and it absolutely positively will not launch. I don't know what the issue with that card is. These cards launch just fine, the Red Devil cards. Nick's been playing on a reference 6800 XT with a water block on it on his rig upstairs in his office, and everything's been fine on those three cards. But the GRE, I've done a DDU, full driver wipe, reinstall, absolutely will not launch. It simply just locks up at the start. So when you launch the game, you get the splash screen, you know, with the sound. It goes like actually sticks. Like, when's the last time you've heard an audio note stick in a computer freeze? It just will not launch. And it's funny because it actually did launch when I first installed it, got into the game type select mode, collect conquest, and then start match. And then as soon as I hit start match, it froze, like mouse cursor froze and everything. And then restarted the system and then started having it lock the second the splash video would start playing. And that has persisted ever since, even with the DDU. So I don't know what's going on with that card. Maybe hopefully that'll get fixed by next week, because they're gonna have another open beta next week where they're gonna make some tweaks and changes. Hopefully they will fix that, whatever that is. But I could not test the GRE, which really sucks, because I still think if you were able to get it, was one of the best value cards you could possibly get for 500 bucks. Moving on, let's talk about CPU usage, because that's the other half of the equation, right? If we take a look at CPU usage, you can see right here, this looks like I gave a kid a crown and some crowns and they just started writing all over the screen right here. But this is actually important. The scale here is the entire usage scale of the CPU from 0 to 100%. So the light blue line, as you can see, the 5090, never exceeded 90% util, and that was only at the very start of the match. And you can see over time it drops down as low as 75 and then back up to 80, 85% util. And that's because we're throwing a lot of frames at it. Now this is a 9800X3D, which is obviously the gaming GOAT. If you're running something like a 9700X or 9600X or a previous gen like 7800, 700 XT or X3D, you're gonna notice more CPU util. But again, that's only if you're running something like a 5090 or a 4090. If you're running, like, look at the 4080 and just how much less usage there is in the purple line. So with the 4080, you can see it's down into the 60s on CPU util. And then obviously as the frame rate drops with lower tier GPUs, the util goes down with it. But they all kind of hover right around the 50 to 55% usage. That's because even with a low-end GPU not throwing a lot of frames, the CPU still has to render all the stuff happening in multiplayer, which is actually harder than single player. Multiplayer is harder on CPU than single player games most of the time, because it has to calculate all that player data and all that information coming from the net, right? So CPU wise, again, I don't think this is gonna be a title that requires any sort of crazy GPU or CPU upgrades for people, which is good, because we need more people to be able to feel like they can play a title that doesn't require them to have to run out and spend thousands of dollars on upgrading their computer. The other thing though is whether or not the title's gonna suck. So far I can say that it has felt a lot like Battlefield 3 meets Battlefield 4 with some Bad Company 2 mixed in there when it comes to building destruction. So far it has been fun to just really sort of kind of experiment with the title to see what they've brought back from the older versions of the games that we've enjoyed and what they've dropped from the newest versions of the games that everyone hates. My least favorite Battlefield of all time was Battlefield 1. I didn't care about World War II or World War I era at all. I just could not get into it. I hated it. The trying to blow up a blimp was the hardest thing on the planet. Like, I don't understand how a blimp can stay afloat as long as it does with fighter planes and everything shooting at it. It was driving me absolutely insane. I just did not like anything about that. Battlefield 5, they were trying to kind of go back to their roots with the whole World War II thing, because Battlefield started with World War II. And Battlefield 5 was fun, but to me, it didn't have a lot of replayability for me. I played with friends and squads and that was it. I kind of gave up on that. Battlefield 2042, that one kind of wrote itself. They tried very hard to copy the COD model with heroes, classes, and everyone just hated it. Then they reverted a lot of that back and went back to the more roots of Battlefield, but it was a little bit too late. A lot of the player base had already dropped off. Future Warfare felt a little gimmicky at times. So they brought this back to current era, and so far the open beta, I will say, has played better than what I felt a lot of the full version releases of previous Battlefields have been. So fingers crossed that DICE and EA don't fuck this up. But let's not forget, this is EA. And DICE definitely gets on its knees to please EA every chance it can. So as long as the EA execs just stay out of the fucking dev room and let the devs do what they need to do, maybe the title will be good. But this is just an open beta, it's just a sampling. But as long as they didn't do any crazy optimizations for the open beta and then the full release becomes harder to run, it's looking pretty promising that you don't have to run out and spend a ton of money on upgrades. All right, guys, if you've been playing the open beta, go ahead and sound off down below how your experience has been. So far, nothing crazy buggy for me has happened in the game. Most of the bugs I've experienced have been in the menu, where sometimes you leave a match and then it won't go back to the main menu. It just keeps recycling the Battlefield screen. They have to exit and go back and then sit in a queue for a couple minutes. Fortunately, the queue hasn't been a problem. Highest queue I've been in so far has been about 36,000, and it took less than 5 minutes to get into the game, so that's promising right there. Nothing like the old World of Warcraft days where you'd see a queue and sit there for an hour or more, but it's looking promising. It's not impossible for a brand to lose its way as much as DICE and EA. It's not impossible for them to find their way back, but it's not common when it's part of the EA ecosystem, if you will. I'm also really hopeful for the newer Battlefront coming out too. And apparently the player base in Battlefront 2 has been jumping up quite a bit. Apparently that game got a whole new pump of life. I don't know what happened. Someone injected life into that title, but new Battlefront is supposed to be coming out in the future too. So fingers crossed on that one. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Sound off how your experience has been with the beta, and we'll update this data as the beta increases or moves forward and when the full release comes out.